I never saw it coming. Not from her, not like this. She was my world, until I caught her stepping out of Ted Walker's hotel room, lipstick smudged, eyes wide with guilt. My heart shattered in that moment, and nothing mattered anymore. The marriage, the kids, the life we built, it all crumbled with that one look. I should have known. The late nights, the cold distance, the lies disguised as work. But seeing it, feeling it rip me apart, that's a whole different kind of hell. And the worst part? It wasn't over yet. My ears were still ringing after the explosion, and I felt lightheaded. After a few moments, I managed to get up on my knees and threw up. I leaned against the wall, trying to gather my thoughts. I was shaking, and it was then I noticed my shirt was stained red. I was bleeding. At first, I didn't know where the blood was coming from, but a sharp pain in my forehead gave me an idea. Carefully, I touched my hairline, and my hand came away covered in blood. Feeling a bit queasy, I probed the wound gently. It seemed like I had a 3 or 4 inch cut diagonally across the left side of my forehead. The blood was flowing heavily, and it stung. As I tried to focus, I noticed most of the men around me were back on their feet. I tore a piece of my shirt to press against my forehead, slowing the bleeding. A quick check showed no other major injuries, except for a tear in my left pant leg where blood was seeping through. With some effort, I ripped the torn section of my pants. A piece of debris was lodged in my leg, and I quickly pulled it out. I tore more pieces of my shirt, using one to tie around my head and another around my leg. After taking stock of my injuries, I realized they weren't life-threatening. It reminded me of something I'd always believed, that we all have a time when our lives are meant to end, and today wasn't mine. But still, the thought crossed my mind that today could be the day. It's strange how life can turn so quickly. When I woke up this morning, my biggest concern was a disagreement with my wife, Cassie. Now, here I was, facing something much more serious. Andy, could you come in here? My wife, Cassie, called as soon as I stepped into the hotel room. We need to talk. We had just arrived in Mexico City for a vacation, staying at the elegant Fantasia Hotel for a 2-week spring break with our kids. My name is Andy Spencer, and I'm a freelance writer. Things between Cassie and me haven't been great for about 6 months. We've grown distant, and I wasn't sure if it was because of her busy schedule or if something else was going on. I had taken a later flight because I was finishing an article for a magazine. Cassie wasn't happy that I had turned part of our vacation into a work trip. I had promised it would only take a day or two, but she was still upset. Recently, Mexico had elected a new president, Carlos Sanchez, who was determined to combat the drug cartels. His approach was to target their businesses, and he had been surprisingly effective. Fox News had hired me to write about the financial side of this drug war because of my background in finance. As an accountant-turned-writer, my career began when I was asked to write about tax changes for a trade magazine. Initially, I was frustrated by the extra work, but it turned out that I enjoyed it, and the article received great feedback. Since then, my writing has been published in various newspapers, and it launched my career. Cassie had once been proud of my accomplishments, but lately she's grown less supportive. When I told Cassie and the kids about my assignment in Mexico, their reactions were quite different. Cassie wasn't pleased, but Kevin and Sally were excited about the adventure. Kevin's eyes lit up and Sally's smile was wide. Kevin had been captivated by broadcasting ever since he built a radio from a kit when he was 10 years old. Although Cassie and I advised him that broadcasting offered limited career paths, Kevin remained enthusiastic. Once I realized how passionate he was about it, I softened my stance. That only added to Cassie's frustrations. She believed he was wasting his potential, and she was upset with me for encouraging him. Cassie also had an interest in broadcasting, but it was mostly related to the celebrities. She would devour fan magazines, mimicking the hairstyles and fashion of her favorite actors. "That sounds amazing, Dad," my son said, bubbling with excitement. "Really? You're going to interrupt our vacation for this?" Cassie remarked, clearly frustrated. "I can't believe how selfish you're being." "It'll only take a day, maybe a day and a half," I replied. "Most of it is already written. I just need some additional information from Mexico. Once I have that, I'm done. It's not a big deal, and they're paying me a decent amount." "Who does Fox have for the series?" Sally asked eagerly. "Maria Shivers," I answered. "Maria Shivers? Wow, can I meet her? Sally exclaimed. Sure, I'll make sure the whole family gets to meet her, I assured her with a shrug. Will the technical crew let me watch? Kevin asked hopefully. Yeah, I think that can be arranged, I replied, though I hoped it was true. I had spoken to the cameraman and sound technician, and they seemed friendly and eager to discuss the project. However, this unexpected job was only creating more tension between Cassie and me. Now that we were in Mexico, I sensed Cassie's frustration boiling over. I had anticipated this conversation for a while, but I was still annoyed that it was happening during our vacation. I couldn't shake off the thought that something might be wrong in our relationship. While I had no solid proof, our diminishing closeness was concerning. Cassie didn't go out often and would occasionally work late but was always open when I called her. It struck me that she could be hiding something, but no one had approached me with concerns about her behavior. So, if she wasn't involved with someone else, why did I sense tension? Our problems had been brewing for quite some time. Cassie had become increasingly distant over the past 6 months, but it had really started to escalate over the previous 2 years. I felt Cassie's ambition to become a partner at her accounting firm was part of the issue. Her father had also wanted that title but never attained it. Now it seemed to be her fixation, and this obsession had intensified over the last few years. The criticisms began gently 2 years ago, with suggestions for me to return to the firm. Then, they evolved into comments about how I was not using my potential. I felt a shift in our relationship, especially when she started discussing what was required for a real man to earn his wife's respect. I knew this conversation was coming. What do we need to talk about, Cassie? I asked as I sank into the couch in our bedroom. Andy, I'm fed up, she said directly. I'm tired of doing everything while you pursue your interests. It feels like you're not pulling your weight. Really? How do you see it that way? I asked, trying to keep calm. I pay most of the household bills, she replied, clearly frustrated. I could feel irritation rise, but I took a deep breath to stay composed. It depends on what you consider household bills. I told you I didn't want to buy that large house, yet you did it anyway. You've forgotten that I cover all the groceries, the kids' clothes, and their activities. I also pay the co-pays for our medical care. And I pay for our insurance, she shot back. That's provided by your job, I countered. Still, they deduct my share from my paycheck, she insisted, unwilling to back down. You mean the $50 a month? You forget that I cover all the gas for our cars. And let's not forget that I also cover all the car maintenance and insurance, I said. As a husband, that's what you're supposed to do, Cassie replied, raising her voice. We paused and looked at each other. I had come to Mexico to share good news about my writing, but now I felt it was better to keep it to myself. It was evident that my wife regarded my work as less important, no matter what I achieved. I was tired of the belittling comments and lack of respect. I loved my wife and kids, but it felt clear to me that Cassie was taking a different path. Finally, I sighed and said, This isn't just about household costs, Cassie. What's really bothering you? She shifted a bit, but then spoke firmly. As you know, I may get a promotion to junior partner. Ted Walker heads the review committee. He mentioned that the senior partners consider the families of potential partners as much as they consider the candidates themselves. That was it, the core issue of my marital troubles, Ted Walker. I had worked briefly with Ted when I was an accountant at the same firm. I was his supervisor, and I had not been impressed. He relied on his charm and good looks. He was smart and could have been an excellent accountant, but he was lazy. It was standard for accountants to check each other's work. At first, as the team leader, Ted brought his work to me for review. I found so many mistakes that I had to address his carelessness. Ted had been furious with me for that, and even more so because I documented it. Now, it felt like he was getting back at me. He seemed determined to ruin my marriage because of my critique. Ted was clever. After my reprimand, he started asking other female accountants to review his work. I'm sure they noticed the same issues, but they never complained. So, when his work finally reached me, it looked perfect. I should have pushed the issue, but I didn't want to deal with it. Now, 6 months later, Ted was Cassie's superior, and he had turned his attention toward her. Ted had the kind of looks that could grace a magazine cover. Just over 6 feet tall, with black hair and a charming smile, he worked the room at parties like a seasoned politician. Unsurprisingly, he was already a partner, and that elevated his status in Cassie's eyes. Cassie was completely taken in by him, and I felt helpless. She dismissed any negative remarks I made about Ted, calling them jealousy from others. My marriage felt like it was falling apart, and I couldn't stop it. Even the fact that Ted had been married 3 times before and was now with his 4th wife did not sway Cassie. Ironically, his current wife, Sylvia, seemed to be the one he wanted to keep. Beautiful and from a very wealthy family, she was an only child after her mother passed away about 5 years ago. Rumor had it her father was worth millions. Problems in my marriage began about a month after Ted joined the company. For the 18 months before his arrival, Cassie had encouraged me to return to my accounting career. But after Ted showed up, the comments turned negative. She would ask things like, "No work this week?" or, "Do you think you'll ever publish one of your books?" Soon, Cassie started to express concern about our finances. Recently, she combined her complaints with the idea that I was holding her back, and now I couldn't figure out what she wanted from me. Her behavior was becoming increasingly frustrating. I sighed loudly, rolling my eyes. "What's bothering him this time?" "Your political articles," Cassie answered, expanding. "He thinks they're too controversial and could reflect poorly on the firm." "So discussing our country's issues is too controversial now?" I replied coolly. "That's a sad statement about your workplace." "What else is he upset about?" I pressed. "He mentioned that the partners are very unhappy you're writing for The Federalist." "So what?" My anger was rising. "I'm trying to make a living here, and last I checked, we still have free speech in this country." "Stop acting like I don't understand." I could see Cassie's frustration growing. "I'm not saying you don't understand," I retorted. "I'm trying to have a reasonable discussion, but you're not making it easy." This whole situation filled me with sadness and anger. Cassie and I had been married for 15 years. We met in college shortly after our first child, Sally, was born. It had been tough, balancing work, caring for a baby, and attending classes, but those challenges and our shared goals had made us stronger. I first encountered Cassie at the University of Texas, where she was 2 years behind me. I was enchanted by her from the start. She was petite, with beautiful black curly hair and deep blue eyes. It was her sense of vulnerability that attracted me. Cassie was shy but very kind. Back then, she was generous to a fault. Today, her beauty was still evident, but if her kindness remained, it was no longer directed at our family. Now, all I saw was a woman focused on her career. In college, we had both pursued accounting, aspiring to be hired by a major firm and become partners. It seemed Cassie had inherited this ambition from her father. Sadly, I couldn't help but feel that he had worn himself out trying to achieve something that seemed impossible. Cassie was a good student, but I excelled even more. I graduated with honors and was offered positions by 3 major accounting firms. I chose the one with an office in Austin so that Cassie could finish her degree. The firm also promised to pay off my student loans if I stayed for 3 years. When Cassie graduated, I helped her secure a position at the same firm. She was smart and hard-working, but I doubted her chances of making partner. Still, I never discouraged her. Though she advanced through the company, her progress was slower than mine. I was on the fast track to becoming a partner, but I had a major problem. I hated my job. Meanwhile, I think Cassie began to question whether she'd ever achieve her goal of making partner. Instead of giving up, she doubled down on her efforts, working harder than ever. Unfortunately, this meant she missed the growing distance between us, and our relationship started to suffer. Over the past 2 years, without fully realizing it, Cassie had also become less involved with our kids, Sally and Kevin. Kevin, who was 3 years younger than Sally, was already distant from his mother. Though I knew Cassie loved him, I sensed that she resented how motherhood had affected her career. In the past 6 months, she had missed nearly all of their activities, and now the kids were starting to feel neglected. Deep down, I think Cassie knew she hadn't been the mother she wanted to be, but I suspected she blamed me for that too. I loved her dearly, but it was painful to watch our marriage unravel, and there seemed to be nothing I could do to stop it. Even if Cassie hadn't been unfaithful to me, I felt it was only a matter of time before something gave way. As I watched her pace the room, I realized that no matter what I said, it wouldn't change her mind. Ted had filled her head with ideas, and she was so focused on her career that she couldn't see anything else. "Doesn't it bother you that your wife earns 6 times what you do?" she asked, her tone sharp. "Don't you have any pride?" How can I respect you if you don't respect yourself? No, it doesn't bother me, I replied, feeling the frustration rise in my chest. It didn't seem to bother you either until Ted showed up. Ted has nothing to do with this, Cassie said defensively. That's not true, and you know it, I said, my voice tight with anger. I have plenty of respect for myself, and I won't let you tear me down. Cassie seemed taken aback for a moment, then softened her tone. Andy, you're one of the best accountants I've ever worked with. The firm would take you back in a second. Fred is retiring soon, and I'm sure you could get back on the partnership track. I looked into her eyes and saw a flicker of hope. Maybe she still cared for me, but I wasn't sure. It felt more like she wanted me to have a job that she deemed respectable. But I was never going back to accounting, and if she couldn't respect what I was doing, our marriage was already over. I don't want to argue anymore, I said, exhausted by the situation. I still loved Cassie, but the strain of our relationship was breaking me. I had a feeling I knew where this conversation was going, and I just wanted it to end. Why don't you just say what you came here to say? I can't keep living like this, she said, uncertainty clouding her face. At least she hadn't outright said she was replacing me with Ted, but the words still hurt. I knew it was best to face this head-on, painful as it was. Okay, I said, trying to keep calm. So far, you've told me I don't measure up, and I need to get a different job. Anything else? Cassie hesitated, but then pressed on. Andy, I'm tired of constantly defending you. Ted says the partners are still unsure about me, and I've worked too hard to lose everything because you won't step up. How can I respect you when you're not fulfilling your responsibilities? I stared at her, feeling the sting of her words. She looked away. I've never shirked my responsibilities, I said firmly. I've been there for every one of our kids' events. How many of you attended? I take care of the house, the repairs, and everything else. What do? You hired help because you don't have time for any of it, and despite all of this, I've loved you completely. So maybe we should leave that subject alone. We stood there in silence, tension thick in the air. I struggled to contain my frustration. I didn't know what Cassie was thinking, but I decided to ask directly. All right, I said, feeling a measure of calm return. What do you think I need to do? Cassie smiled and reached for her briefcase. It's simple, Andy. I've spoken to HR and I have an employment application here. I've also discussed things with several of the partners, including Mr. Bracken, the chairman of the board. They're all on board for you to return to the firm. The position includes a starting salary of $200,000. I glanced at the application and set it down on the coffee table. And if I don't want to return? Cassie pulled another folder from her briefcase. I spoke to a family law attorney. If you don't wrap up your writing assignments and apply for this position or seek employment at another firm within 90 days, I'll file for divorce. Her words hit hard, and I knew Ted Walker had a hand in this. Cassie couldn't see that she was being influenced by him. I felt defeated and knew it was time to walk away. A line from the song The Gambler crossed my mind. Know when to hold them, know when to fold them. This was the moment to fold. I picked up the divorce papers and skimmed through them. If I have to file, the terms are fair, Cassie continued. I don't want to go that route and I don't want to hurt you, but Ted says that if you don't change, I won't be able to make partner. The settlement outlined in the papers seemed reasonable. She'd pay me half the equity in the house, combine our 401(k)s and split them evenly. There would be no child support, but she would have primary custody of the kids with generous visitation rights for me. She'd also pay me $3,000 a month for 5 years. My anger simmered beneath the surface as I grabbed a pen and made some changes. Then I signed and dated the document. Why wait? I said, tossing the papers on top of the employment application. I made a few changes. First, I don't want a penny from that house. It was your decision. I don't want your alimony, and I'm not interested in your 401(k). I'm insisting on joint custody of the kids. They'll live with me every other month. I've already signed the papers, so you can go ahead and file them. Cassie's eyes widened. I'm not having an affair with Ted, she protested, her voice sharp. It doesn't matter, I said quietly. If it hasn't happened yet, it will once this is over. This is a good deal for you. Just sign the papers. No, Cassie said firmly. I told you I'd give you 90 days, and I'm sticking to that. I hope you come to your senses. Feeling the weight of everything, I grabbed my laptop and walked out of the room before I lost my temper. Cassie. I watched Andy leave, shaking from the intensity of our conversation. It had seemed so clear and logical when Ted and I discussed it, but now I wasn't sure. I didn't know if I was more upset that Andy had dismissed my concerns so easily or that he seemed ready to move on without me. Ted had assured me that being firm with Andy would make him come around. I knew the conversation would be difficult, but I hadn't expected it to go so wrong. I had never seen Andy act like that. Maybe Ted was right. It might be time to move on. The truth was, I was drawn to Ted. Was Andy right? Was it only a matter of time before I ended up with Ted? The thought scared me. Ted represented everything that Andy wasn't. Ted was confident and commanding, someone people looked up to. The clients adored him, and many of the women at the office admired him too. Andy wasn't unattractive, but Ted had an undeniable presence. And Ted was already a full partner, embodying the kind of success I had always admired. I couldn't help but feel conflicted. Andy and I had been happy once. Why was everything so complicated now? Why couldn't Andy see how important this was for me? The longer I thought about it, the angrier I became. Andy knew how much becoming a partner meant to me, and yet he wasn't willing to support me. I had worked so hard to get this far, and just when I was close, he was getting in the way. I had heard rumors about Ted, but they always seemed to come from people who felt threatened by him. There was talk of affairs, but whenever I saw him with his wife, Sylvia, he was attentive. Still, Sylvia seemed distant toward Ted's colleagues, especially the women. I wanted to call Ted and talk, but since his wife was with him on this trip, that wouldn't be appropriate. Still, I had a business meeting scheduled with him and a few others tomorrow night to discuss clients. I planned to use some of that time to talk about Andy. Maybe I should file the divorce papers now and get it over with. But I had promised Andy 90 days. Everything in my personal life seemed to be unraveling. I remembered how much I had once loved Andy. When we first met, it was his kind eyes and warm smile that won me over. Andy might not have been as commanding as Ted, but he had a quiet strength that I had fallen for. Where had it all gone wrong? Early on, I used to feel jealous whenever other girls showed interest in Andy, but over time, I grew to trust him completely. Now everything felt uncertain, and I wasn't sure how I felt about our relationship anymore. Still, Ted was someone I could talk to, and he could help guide me, no matter what direction things took with Andy. This whole confrontation left me shaken. Was I falling out of love with my husband? Just a year ago, that idea would have been unimaginable. But now I realized I no longer had the same respect for him. When I compared Andy to Ted, the differences felt stark. Andy had written 2 books, but neither had been published. He had received rejection after rejection. It saddened me to admit, but he didn't seem like the same person I had married. If I couldn't respect him, how could our marriage continue? I wanted him to be more like Ted. And if Andy wouldn't change, maybe, well, I didn't know what I'd do. The idea of divorce made me feel sick. Would I really go through with it if Andy refused to change? If I wanted to make partner, it seemed like I'd have to. Just then, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, I found Kevin and Sally standing there. "Is Dad here?" Kevin asked. "His things are here," Sally said, spotting his suitcase and garment bag on the bed. "Where is he, Mom?" "It's not my job to keep track of him," I replied sharply. Both kids fell silent and exchanged glances. "Did you and Dad have an argument?" Sally asked cautiously. "That's none of your business," I snapped. "They had a fight," Kevin muttered, pulling Sally by the arm. "Let's go find Dad. I want him to team up with me for the trivia contest this afternoon." After they left, I sat down on the bed, frustration building inside me. Now the kids were turning against me too. I desperately needed to talk to Ted. He'd help me sort everything out. I looked at the divorce papers on the coffee table, tempted to sign them. That would show Andy. He'd have no choice but to abandon his writing and return to something more practical. Maybe then I'd consider taking him back, or maybe not. But what if he didn't come back? I stared at the papers, realizing I wasn't ready to sign them yet. But after the 90 days, if Andy didn't change, I would file for divorce. Andy. I left the hotel room, humiliated and frustrated. In a way, this was my fault. I could have dealt with Ted early on, but I hadn't taken him seriously. I didn't realize he'd hold such a grudge or that his actions would affect my marriage. Back then, I was more focused on learning to write than worrying about Ted. After writing my first article, I started contributing human interest stories to the local newspaper. They published all of them, though I wasn't paid. It was a good confidence booster. Eventually, a couple of my pieces were picked up by a larger paper, the Austin American-Statesman. Even though I still wasn't getting paid, it felt like progress. During that time, I wrote my first novel. But after sending it to countless publishers, I received around 400 rejection letters. Despite the setbacks, I didn't give up and began working on my second book. As my interest in writing grew, I became increasingly unhappy at my day job. Meanwhile, Cassie was excelling in her career, earning 2 promotions. Financially, we were fine, but I knew something had to change for me. At first, I wasn't sure how to get writing assignments, but I found several websites that connected writers with magazines. I started pitching ideas, and after a lot of rejections, one of my ideas was accepted. I earned $300 for the article. Encouraged, I kept querying, and eventually about 1 in 5 ideas was accepted. In the beginning, many of my articles came back with suggestions for changes, which I gladly made. Over time, my work was accepted without revisions. One of my biggest breaks came when I pitched an idea to a fitness magazine. I had met an NFL strength coach who shared his personal fitness routine with me. The magazine loved it, and the article earned me $750. In my first year of writing, I made around $4,500. By the second year, I had earned over $14,000, but balancing writing, family, and my job was becoming difficult. I had initially promised myself I wouldn't let writing take time away from my family or work, but I found myself breaking that promise. To manage, I scaled back my article writing and focused on finishing my second book. Unfortunately, it didn't find a publisher either, so I returned to writing magazine articles. I had tried to explain my frustration to Cassie, but she didn't really understand. She showed mild interest when my first articles were published, but beyond that, she wasn't engaged. Cassie had little interest in the corporate world. It was just a hobby to her. She often reminded me that I was in a rough patch and would eventually get through it. However, a recent incident at work forced me to confront my situation. I had a disagreement with Fred Tompkins, a higher-up at the firm. It should have been clear that arguing with someone in his position was not going to end well. Fred had a reputation for being difficult. It was hard to understand why he had been promoted to partner. While he knew his field, he rarely took on any real work. What made it worse was his poor leadership skills. His team didn't respect him because he would take credit for their successes and blame others when things went wrong. I had my issues with him, but looking back, I might owe him some gratitude. Ultimately, he was the one who pushed me to leave a job I despised. As my dissatisfaction at work grew, Cassie was diligently advancing her career. I didn't have the heart to tell her I doubted her chances of making partner. The reality was that while Cassie was an excellent accountant, she struggled with the sales aspect crucial for that role. She might have had a shot at becoming a junior partner one day, but that was years away if it ever happened. I decided that discussing this would only create tension between us. Over the years, I started getting more freelance writing jobs without having to look for them. As these opportunities became more lucrative, Fred decided to blame me for a recent error in an audit that missed an important detail. Our conversation escalated and he formally reprimanded me. I then gathered my work to show that the error had been overlooked by someone else. I wrote a detailed explanation to our supervisors, highlighting that the fault lay with Fred for not properly reviewing the work. Although I didn't know if Fred faced any consequences, my reprimand remained in place. I could have appealed, but instead, I chose to resign. Cassie was upset with my decision and urged me to apologize to Fred. This was the first time I felt truly angry with her. I couldn't accept apologizing to him. I hadn't done anything wrong. That night, I slept in the guest room voluntarily and stayed there for a couple more days. On the 4th morning, I found Cassie in tears in the kitchen. She asked if I was planning to leave her. I embraced her and assured her that I would stay unless she wanted me to go. She decided to take a sick day, and we spent the rest of the day together. Later, I found myself in a hotel bar, reflecting on my troubled marriage. I was on the verge of tears but had anticipated this situation. Now that things were out in the open, it was up to Cassie to decide what happened next. I was ready for a divorce if that's what she wanted. Cassie, The more I reflected on my marriage problems, the more anxious I became. Why couldn't my husband see reason? We needed to talk through our issues, but he seemed determined to distance himself from me. It felt like he wanted a divorce, and I found myself uncertain about what that would mean for our lives. If it came to it, would I want to be involved with Ted, even though he was married? The idea of an affair had crossed my mind, but I didn't want to complicate anything. I couldn't believe I was even considering such thoughts about anyone. I needed to figure out if I still loved my husband, but my emotions were all mixed up. That night's dinner with the kids felt tense. Andy wasn't there, and the kids kept asking about their father. When I declined to answer, Sally bluntly asked if we were getting a divorce. I couldn't respond, and she left the table in tears, followed shortly by Kevin. When I knocked on their door later, they ignored me, and the same thing happened when I tried calling. I decided to give them space and hoped to talk things over in the morning, although I wasn't sure what I should say. When I returned to our room, Andy was still gone. My initial frustration turned to worry, and I considered looking for him or calling someone. However, I figured he might just need some time alone and hoped some distance would make him think things through. Plus, searching for him might show my vulnerability. As I lay in bed, I remembered that Andy was scheduled to meet with Maria Shivers the next day. Kevin and Sally were looking forward to seeing the news anchor, and although I was invited, I decided not to go. I briefly thought about preventing the kids from meeting her, but dismissed that quickly, knowing it would only push them further away. I felt a mix of irritation at the idea of Andy spending time with someone like Maria and guilt over how this was affecting the kids. Unable to sleep well that night, I was determined to confront Andy in the morning. We needed to sort this out, and he had to understand my perspective. But when I woke up at 7, it was clear Andy had already been in the room and left. He had taken his toiletries and a change of clothes. He had come and gone without a word. I felt a wave of frustration toward Andy. He was avoiding the situation and seemed intent on distancing himself from me. I started to wonder if I should proceed with filing for divorce. It seemed like nothing was working between us, and I couldn't help but think this was all Andy's doing. There was a knock at the door. When I opened it, Kevin was standing there. "Do you know where Dad is?" "No," I replied. "It looks like he came in to grab some clean clothes while I was asleep." "Are you guys really getting a divorce?" Kevin asked, his voice shaky. "Sally says you are, and that it's because you're always working." That comment stung. "I have responsibilities," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Whatever," Kevin muttered as he walked away. I could hear his phone ringing as he neared his room. He answered, saying, "Dad, where are you?" "Okay, we'll be there in 5 minutes. Sally's going to be excited. Are you sure they don't mind me helping?" "Great, see you soon." Now, I felt even more upset with Andy. He was letting the kids think this was my fault, and nothing was going the way I expected. I was sure Ted could help me sort through everything. We had a dinner meeting scheduled in a couple of days to discuss some clients and my upcoming work schedule. Ted had already outlined several projects that could push me toward a junior partnership at the firm. Later, I got a call from Ted asking if we could move the meeting to that night. Originally, it was planned with other associates, and we had intended to teleconference with clients. But Ted said this new plan would allow more focused, one-on-one time to discuss my future at the company. I was thrilled at the chance to get a clearer picture of what I needed to do to move forward. As I prepared for dinner with Ted, I couldn't help but think about my situation with Andy. I still had feelings for him, but I didn't want him to stand in the way of my career. His refusal to understand how important my work was frustrated me. And now Kevin was talking about pursuing a career in broadcasting, which irked me. That was Andy's influence, and I wasn't happy about it. By the time Andy arrived, dressed in a suit and tie, I had mixed emotions. He looked great, and the kids were excited to spend time with him. I could only wish he saw things from my perspective. "You look wonderful," Andy said with a warm smile, which made me feel a moment of happiness. But it quickly faded when I told him I couldn't join them for dinner because I had a business meeting with Ted. The kids' expressions showed their disappointment, and Andy just shrugged and said, "Okay." Dinner with Ted was a bit strange. He complimented me throughout the evening, but the conversation rarely touched on business. When I brought up the issues with Andy, Ted advised me to be more firm. He believed Andy would come around if I pushed harder. We eventually shifted to discussing my career, and Ted started outlining what he thought I should aim to accomplish in the next 3 months. But just as he began, he stopped talking. He pointed toward the entrance and asked, "Is that your husband with Maria Shivers?" "What?" I turned around, stunned to see Andy entering the dining room with Maria and the kids. I knew they had plans to meet, but I didn't expect them to have dinner together. Maria looked stunning, and she was walking arm in arm with Andy while the kids followed, looking thrilled. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on them. Andy helped Maria into her chair, and the kids eagerly sat down across from them, their faces lit with excitement. Maria leaned in close to Andy, and her hand rested on his arm. A wave of jealousy washed over me, followed by a sharp pang of anger. How could Andy flaunt her like that in front of everyone? I barely registered what Ted was saying after that, and I could tell even he was distracted by the scene. Finally, after Ted paid the bill, I said with an icy tone, "Let's go see what they're up to." As we approached their table, Andy stood up and greeted us with a calm smile. "Maria, this is my wife, Cassie, and her boss, Ted Walker," he said smoothly. "Cassie, Ted, this is Maria Shivers." Ted flashed his charming smile and moved next to Maria's chair. He took her hand and lightly kissed it. "Miss Shivers, it's an honor to meet you." Maria's expression tightened slightly, but she managed a polite smile. "Thank you." She then turned to me, her smile widening. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Spencer. You're very fortunate. Your husband is quite charming and has done a lot for our series. I hope you'll excuse me for taking him away from your vacation." "No problem," I replied coolly. "We'll have plenty of vacation time. Andy has his work and I have mine, but I'm sure we'll find time for fun. Kids, let me know when you're back in your room." "Would you like to join us?" Maria asked, gesturing to the empty side of the large table. The last thing I wanted was to sit down with Miss Shivers, but I noticed Ted's eyes sparkling with interest. It was clear he was eager to stay, so I decided it was best to go along with it to avoid embarrassing Kevin and Sally. I figured we could stay for a few minutes and then slip away, allowing Ted and me to continue our earlier discussion. What I thought would be a brief visit turned into 30 minutes. I couldn't get Ted to budge. He was clearly captivated, and my hints to leave went unnoticed. Ted's charm was on full display, yet Maria seemed quite composed. Much of the conversation revolved around her upcoming series about the challenges faced during the Mexican drug trade, and she was still working out some details. Initially, I had thought Maria was flirting with Andy, but I realized they were just exchanging ideas. When Maria liked one of his suggestions, she would acknowledge him warmly. Even though they were discussing business, Maria made an effort to include everyone in the conversation, often asking the kids for their opinions. They generally reacted positively, though there were times they didn't fully grasp an idea or disagreed. I knew Andy valued their input, so I was surprised that Maria listened and adjusted her thoughts based on their feedback. At one point, she acknowledged Kevin's suggestion, saying, "I think you're right, Kevin. We'll keep it as it is." At some point during the discussion, Sally asked Maria about the experience of being in the public eye. Maria caught me off guard with her response. "It's challenging," she said without hesitation. "I wouldn't wish it on anyone. When I first started on television, the attention was exciting. Over time, though, it's become overwhelming. You can't go anywhere without being recognized. Just walking in here tonight, everyone suddenly stopped and stared. I dislike that. So, Sally, let me be clear. Being famous is not what it seems. People expect perfection, and the media tends to focus on the negative. Every moment, I'm aware of my appearance. It's exhausting." "That doesn't sound enjoyable," Sally replied sympathetically. "But would you ever quit?" "Certainly not," Maria laughed. "I may have made it sound one-sided. There are wonderful parts of my job, too. I meet fascinating people and travel the world. Plus, I'm well compensated. Right now, I have a 7-year contract with Fox, and I intend to honor it. When it's done, I hope to negotiate for less visibility. I want to work on more projects like this, and if I can do more during my current contract, even better." "We should be going," I said, glancing at Ted as I stood up. "We still have clients to discuss and my schedule to review for the next few months." Ted hesitated momentarily before quickly standing. "Yes, that's right. Miss Shivers, it's been a pleasure. I hope we can chat again soon." Maria nodded at Ted and then looked at me. Mrs. Spencer, thank you for allowing your husband to work with me. This project has been invaluable, and I've greatly enjoyed collaborating with Andy. From what I heard about this show, it sounds excellent, I replied earnestly. I was pleased with their project and Andy's contributions. However, at that moment, I wanted to discuss my aspirations with Ted. He was the key to my advancement, which was my priority. As we prepared to leave, Andy checked his watch and turned to the kids. Hey, didn't you want to see the magic show in the main ballroom? Cassie, are you going that way? Could you take the kids? Miss Shivers and I need to wrap up a few things. I think the kids can manage on their own, I said quickly, feeling frustrated that he was trying to put them in my care. I noticed Andy's expression harden slightly as he glanced at Ted. I felt a flicker of satisfaction seeing a hint of jealousy in him. I also realized my earlier feelings of jealousy toward Maria were unnecessary. She had no romantic interest in Andy. Still, she clearly respected his work. After departing the restaurant, Ted and I made our way to the hotel bar. We settled in and enjoyed a couple of drinks. Ted took the time to commend my work and outline what I needed to do to secure the junior partnership. He ended by saying that the partnership was practically assured for me. That news had me feeling fantastic. As we headed to the elevator, Ted suggested I stop by his room to review a list of tasks for the upcoming days and weeks. I was eager to see it so I could start planning. Maybe it was the drinks at dinner and at the bar, or maybe it was the excitement of nearing my next goal. Whatever the reason, I let myself relax. Once in his room, Ted rummaged through his briefcase. "Where did I put that schedule?" he muttered as he continued searching. "Why don't you pour us a drink while I look? Then we can celebrate your upcoming success." Not thinking clearly, I poured 2 drinks and handed one to Ted. Eventually, he found the spreadsheet and sat down on the bed, patting a spot next to him, so I joined him. He began to explain the details to me, his compliments making me feel flattered. At some point, he paused and looked into my eyes. "Cassie, you're wonderful," Ted said before leaning in. I should have stepped away, but instead I responded. He then moved closer, which was when I realized things were escalating too quickly for my comfort. Suddenly, I snapped back to reality. I realized Ted wasn't interested in helping me advance my career. He had other intentions. I felt foolish for not seeing it sooner. Thankfully, I resisted and realized just in time. "Ted, what do you think you're doing?" I said, backing toward the door. "I didn't expect this from you," he replied sharply. "You knew how this would go if you came here." "I'm done," I said as I grabbed my purse and headed out the door. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, I saw Andy just passing by. The look on his face made me feel ashamed. How could I have acted so naively? Andy. I watched as Cassie left the dining room with Ted, and it broke my heart. I had to keep my composure until the kids finished their desserts and we moved on to the magic show. I didn't want to share my personal issues with Miss Shivers. "This has been a great evening," Maria said as she started gathering her papers. Then she paused and looked at me with an unreadable expression. "You are a very lucky man, Andy. You have a beautiful wife, wonderful kids, and you're quite talented. I envy you. You have everything I wish for." "Oh, I doubt you'd want my life. Your life seems to be going quite well," I replied, forcing a smile to hide my sadness. "You're stunning, single, and your career is thriving. Ted was definitely interested in you. It's curious, though, how you seem to ignore him. Is that your secret to keeping men intrigued?" Maria sighed and shook her head. "No, I meet men like Ted all the time. They believe they're charming. I'm certain he could get most women to be interested in him. I have no interest in men like that. I want someone who genuinely cares about me, not for my fame." "Really, I, and many others, think you have it all," I said with a light laugh. Maria smiled sadly. "Then you would be mistaken. It's exhausting never being able to go out without people approaching me. I meant it when I said I dislike being famous. I struggle to keep a boyfriend because they often feel overpowered by my presence. It can get lonely." "I'm truly sorry to hear that," I said sincerely. "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." "You're kind, Andy," Maria said as she collected her things, but then hesitated. "If you think your wife wouldn't mind, it might be nice to have someone to talk to who isn't interested in using me." "Here's my card," I offered, giving her my business card. "Feel free to call me anytime. During the day is best, but I'm usually awake late and up early." If things get tough, don't hesitate to reach out, although I can't guarantee I'll be coherent at odd hours." Maria laughed and gave me a quick peck on the cheek. "Thanks. I appreciate it. Also, I'm considering a story about issues in Hollywood. Would you be interested in working on it?" "I'm up for any writing project," I quickly responded. "I'll tackle whatever you need. I'll make sure to finish the rewrites so you'll have them in the morning." I grabbed my bag and left, knowing I had a lot of writing to do that night, likely staying up late. I planned to stop by Cassie's room to let her know I'd be coming in late so she wouldn't worry. As I was passing Ted's room, the door opened and Cassie stepped out. Her appearance sent a wave of concern through me. Our eyes locked for what felt like forever. Finally, Cassie spoke. Nothing happened. Despite my fears of losing Cassie to Ted, the situation before me was heartbreaking. So many emotions surged through me in those intense moments. I felt immobilized for a few seconds longer. With hurt and anger rising in me, I managed to say, "Please sign the papers and file for the divorce." As I turned to leave, Cassie grasped my arm. Nothing happened. Ted made advances and I left. "Andy, we need to talk." I pulled my arm away and quickly walked down the hall, needing to get away from both Cassie and Ted. "Please, Andy, don't leave," I heard Cassie say, her voice breaking. "Nothing happened." Just as I reached the elevators, one of the doors opened and a couple stepped out. I got in and pressed the button for both the main floor and the rooftop. I didn't care which direction it went. The last thing I saw as the doors closed was Cassie standing there, looking pale. Though I had the urge to drink, I knew I had work to finish for Fox. When the elevator stopped, I saw the rooftop bar to the right. But before entering, I took a moment to observe the rooftop. There was a pool at the edge, surrounded by railings for safety. The view while swimming must have been breathtaking. A small miniature golf course and enclosed basketball areas were also nearby. The snack bar was closed for the night. Everything I saw was impressive, but I had no time to admire it. I had work to do, even though my heart felt broken. I settled into a quiet corner and opened my laptop. From where I sat, I could see Cassie enter the bar, looking for me, but she didn't spot me. After a while, she left. I stared at the screen for a long time, unable to focus. I glanced at the bar, thinking a drink might help. After sipping on my second one, my mind wandered to what I'd need to do when I got home. Open new bank accounts, remove Cassie from my 401k, find a place to live, and decide what to take from our house. I decided I would finish this assignment and head back to the U.S. The kids would be upset, but Cassie had made her choice. It would be best to start fresh. I planned to leave after I was sure Maria had everything she needed. Once I finished my rewrites, I sent them to Maria. To my surprise, the bar was empty. I checked my watch. It was 4 a.m. Not wanting to go back to the room, I decided to stretch out on one of the lounge chairs by the pool. Before I did, I called the front desk and asked them to rearrange my flight. The hotel offered a service to handle such requests, so I asked for the earliest flight back to Austin. If that wasn't available, I'd settle for a flight through Houston. With that done, I lay down, unsure if I'd be able to sleep, but eventually it came over me. I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was a text from Maria. "Big news. My room at 7 a.m. I checked the time, 6 o'clock. Instead of going back to the room to change, I cleaned up in the men's room and grabbed a coffee at the rooftop restaurant. By the time I arrived at Maria's room, everyone was already there. I slipped into a seat next to Pete. "What's happening?" I asked. "No idea," he said, shaking his head. Maria walked in, smiling brightly. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. I've got great news. We've secured an interview with the President of Mexico." The room erupted with conversation, but Maria quickly quieted everyone. "As you know, the International Association of Police Chiefs is holding a conference here, which is why we chose this hotel. Our goal was to interview several police chiefs about the drug war. Well, I was notified that the Mexican president plans to meet with the governing body this morning. After weeks of trying, we've been granted an interview." "How much time do we have with him?" Sandra, the producer, asked. "Only 20 minutes, so we need to make every question count," Maria replied. I wasn't sure why I had been called to this meeting. While it was great news for the show, it didn't seem to involve me. I stood up and approached Maria. I wanted to wish her well and get out of Mexico City as soon as possible. "Andy, thanks for coming," Maria said with a warm smile. Your rewrites were excellent. Judging by your clothes, you didn't get much sleep. I really appreciate the effort, but I have a favor to ask. I know it's beyond your assignment and I can't promise extra pay, but I'd like you to prepare the questions. I was both surprised and flattered. I thought your staff in New York handled that? Maria chuckled. By the time they get around to it, the interview would be over. I like how you think. You focus on what's most important and make it understandable. I need at least 30 questions ranked by priority. I also need them quickly because the interview is at 9. I shrugged and said, sure. 50 minutes later, I printed out 42 questions. Maria signaled for me to sit next to her while she reviewed my work. It felt a bit surreal sitting next to someone as famous and beautiful as Maria. I wouldn't admit it, but I was a bit nervous. To calm myself, I watched the crew as they transformed the sitting room into a mini studio. Pete and Billy finished setting up the camera and sound equipment. The makeup team looked busy, and Sandra was on her cell phone, chatting excitedly. I guessed she was talking to her bosses in New York. This is great, Andy, Maria said enthusiastically. I just need some clarification on a few questions. Mind helping me with that? Not at all, I replied, and we started reviewing the questions. 25 minutes later, we finished, and Maria smiled. I knew you were the right person for this job. With that, Maria reached over and gave me a quick hug. Well, I'll let you prepare for your show, I said as I stood up. Maria took my hand. Don't you want to stay and meet the president of Mexico? I would, but I have some family matters to take care of, I said as I checked my phone for my flight time. I have a flight at 10:40-something. Just change your flight to a later time, and I'm sorry how thoughtless of me, Maria said, tapping her forehead. Please, invite your family to come up here too. It would be a wonderful opportunity for your kids and your wife to meet the president. I paused for a moment. If it were just Cassie and me, I might pass. But Maria was right. This was an amazing chance for the kids. It's not every day you meet a leader from another country. I didn't want to miss this experience for Sally and Kevin just because of my situation with their mother. I could hold it together for a little while longer. Exiting Maria's somewhat chaotic room, I found the hallway pleasantly quiet. I called the front desk first to rebook my ticket. Thankfully, Fox was covering the cost. I took a deep breath and called Callie's cell phone. Andy? She answered on the first ring. Thank goodness you called. We need to talk. Later, I responded quickly. Something great has come up that I think the kids will enjoy. Maria is interviewing the president of Mexico and invited us to meet him. I thought it would be a fantastic opportunity for the kids. You're invited too. Can we please talk afterward? Cassie pleaded. Of course, I said, but I didn't think there was much to discuss. Thank you. I'll get the kids ready and be right up. Cassie sounded relieved. What's her room number? 4915, I replied, and hung up. Cassie. My heart raced when I saw Andy was calling. I silently thanked my lucky stars. I had been in a panic since discovering his flight confirmation that morning. Seeing Andy after I had just left Ted's room shook me to my core. It felt like my whole life was flashing before my eyes, ready to crash. For the first time, I realized how my actions must have affected Andy. I had ignored my kids for my work and had disrespected my husband. All for the slim chance of advancing my career. I was now terrified that I had ruined my marriage and family. All night, I woke up trying to call Andy's phone. Either he didn't answer or it was off. When morning came, seeing his flight confirmation made me anxious. I desperately wanted to explain that I had been foolish, that nothing happened, and tell him I loved him. I wanted him to hold me and reassure me everything would be okay. After Andy's call, I rushed to the kids' room and woke them up. When I told them they would meet the president of Mexico, they both jumped up enthusiastically. I made sure they knew their dad set it up through Maria Shivers. Sally was thrilled, and Kevin beamed with excitement. As we headed to Maria Shivers' suite, I felt nervous, my stomach in knots. I knew if Maria hadn't invited the kids, Andy might have turned it down. I doubted he would have reached out to me otherwise. The hurt I saw on his face was unforgettable. When we got off the elevator, Andy was waiting in the hall, looking like he hadn't slept much. I guessed it was due to everything he had witnessed. I wished I could just fall into his arms and have him forgive me. But I realized I had made a mess of things, and it might not be fixable. But I had to try. Andy nodded at me and hugged the kids. Come on in. The president hasn't arrived yet, and they're still setting up for the interview. The suite was buzzing with activity. The Fox technicians were making final preparations, and Maria's makeup artist was doing last-minute touches. Suddenly, 2 security guards entered and took up positions by the door. Andy led us to a corner out of the way. After her makeup was done, Maria came over and looked genuinely happy to see us. "I'm so glad you could make it," she said, giving each of us a friendly hug. I noticed that she seemed to hug Andy a bit longer than she did the rest of us, but I chose to ignore it. I didn't want my feelings of jealousy to ruin my limited chances to reconnect with my husband. How could I have been so selfish? As I observed the professionals around me performing their roles, I realized how significant Andy had been to this production. It suddenly hit me how mistaken I'd been about his career. I felt embarrassed for having belittled his work. My father always cherished the idea that anyone working hard deserved respect, no matter their job. He treated everyone with dignity, from his brother, who was a garbage man, to those in higher positions. I saw Andy, taking in the buzz of activity around him. He truly seemed to enjoy it. Kevin was delighted to chat with Pete and Billy, and Sally looked as excited as a child in a candy shop. Maria visited twice, once to ask about a detail in the script Andy had prepared, and again to check on a spreadsheet provided by the network. Andy's replies were brief, but whatever he said seemed to make Maria happy. Then the door swung open, and a tall man walked in. He wore a business suit, but I noticed the outline of something concealed beneath it. He had dark hair and serious eyes, suggesting he was part of the president's security team. "My name is Captain Lopez," he stated, and the room fell silent. "The president will join us soon. He has a packed schedule, so please do not keep him waiting. Once he arrives, he has 20 minutes for an interview before we need to leave." A moment later, the door opened again, and another man entered with more guards. This individual wasn't as tall and had soft blue eyes. His friendly smile seemed to light up the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Lopez announced, "it is my honor to present Carlos Miguel Sanchez, the President of Mexico." Everyone began to clap, and it felt appropriate. The president appeared a bit flustered by the applause. "Please, no formalities," he said, raising his hands. "I am privileged to be here and eager to discuss our efforts against the drug cartels." Maria was right by the president's side as he finished speaking. "Mr. President, thank you for agreeing to this interview," she said with a radiant smile. The president returned her smile and gently kissed her hand. "Miss Shivers, thank you. I hope this interview raises awareness in your Congress to support our fight. Mr. President, if you allow me a moment, I would like to introduce you to the people behind the work that led us here." "It would be my pleasure, Miss Shivers." Maria then introduced her team. The president made sure to acknowledge each introduction warmly, making everyone feel valued. I watched as he engaged with Sally and Kevin, and it was clear they were thrilled by the opportunity their father had arranged. After speaking with my children, President Sanchez turned to me and smiled warmly. "Ah, Mrs. Spencer, your husband is fortunate. You and your children are wonderful." Even though I knew he was a seasoned politician, I couldn't help but blush a little. When he turned to Andy, I was genuinely surprised to see his eyes light up. "Mr. Spencer, I commend your work for this show. Miss Shivers shared many details with my office. Your clear presentation of our issues surprised even my closest advisors. Your contributions will be invaluable to us." I watched as Andy blushed, which was unusual since his complexion rarely showed color. He humbly replied, "Most of the work was done by Miss Shivers' team. I merely helped organize the information." "No, you contributed significantly, Mr. Spencer, and I appreciate it." Once the introductions were wrapped up, Andy began to guide us toward the door, but I heard Maria asking him to stay briefly. Asterisk, asterisk, Andy. Asterisk, asterisk. When the president settled in for the interview, I knew it was time to manage my family's exit. As I helped Cassie and the kids toward the door, Maria called for me. "Andy, can you stay for a minute?" I nodded and held the door for my family. Once it closed, I turned back to Maria. "Andy, I need one more favor," she said with a smile. "I know your contract is complete, but could you stay in the hall during the interview? It would be great to have you nearby in case any questions arise." "Of course," I replied and stepped into the hall. Most of the crowd had already dispersed. Only my family, Maria's makeup artist, Captain Lopez, and several security personnel remained, all visibly armed. Approaching Cassie and the kids, I noticed a look of determination and, surprisingly, fear on my wife's face. She seemed eager to discuss last night's events and my career. I wanted to address it, but was concerned about being interrupted. "Can we go somewhere and talk as a family?" Cassie asked. That she wanted a discussion was expected, but involving our kids in this way surprised me. I began to wonder if she intended to use them to sway my acceptance of her plans with Ted. The more I thought about it, the more it irritated me. Yet I didn't want to create a scene, especially with the kids around. "I can't leave just yet," I countered. Maria asked me to stay until the interview finished, in case there were any questions. It should only take about 20 minutes. "Why don't you and the kids head back to the room? I'll call when it's done." Cassie shook her head. "We'll wait for you." "That might be boring for the kids," I said calmly. "Why don't you let them do something else?" "If it's okay with you, Dad," Kevin quickly said, "I'd like to stay. Maybe I can help Pete and Billy with their equipment." "I want to stay too," Sally added. "Maybe I can talk to Miss Shivers or the president." "We're all staying," Cassie said firmly. I didn't like it at all. I didn't want to be pushed into accepting Cassie's growing closeness with Ted. I had been wondering about their relationship, but last night made me worried that things had gone too far. It was frustrating. I moved away and leaned against the wall near the door, simmering in my thoughts when I heard Captain Lopez's radio crackle to life. Whatever was said made the captain change his expression, and he began speaking quickly into his radio. "Oh no!" the captain exclaimed, and hurried into Maria's suite. Even without knowing Spanish, I understood that something serious was happening. I followed him inside. "Mr. President, we have to leave," he said in English, grabbing the president's arm. "There are armed men in the hotel." Hey, listeners, if you enjoyed watching this video and want to stay updated with our latest content, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss out on what's coming next. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video with Queen Cheating Tales.